Holy Lord, Almighty Father, everlasting God, and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ,
I promise to give my soul to Satan.
37 banned movies, 7 levels. This is the ultimate banned movies iceberg. We'll start with some well-known banned movies and slowly move to movies you've never heard of, which might be for your own good. Let's start at the tip of the iceberg. Level 1. The Exorcist, 1973. William Friedkin's The Exorcist follows 12-year-old Regan McNeil's descent into demonic possession and her mother's desperate efforts to save her through a harrowing and increasingly disturbing Catholic exorcism. So disturbing that the movie became an immediate worldwide controversy from the day of its release. The film's graphic depictions of Regan's transformation include violent outbursts, with a crucifix, projectile vomiting, and levitation, coupled with its deep exploration of religious doubt, proved to be far too much for people, especially religious groups who deemed it blasphemous and unsuitable for a wide audience. Within months, the movie was banned or extremely censored in over 40 countries all over the world. In the UK, the movie was legally banned from being distributed on home video for 11 years due to concerns that minors might somehow access the movie. The British Board of Film Classification was worried that the severe emotional impact on teenagers would be irreversible, especially on young girls. By 1999, the culture had shifted enough that the movie was finally released on home video, allowing everyone to see it. Malaysia, Singapore, Lebanon, Tunisia, and other Arab-majority nations also banned it outright, citing moral and religious objections to its content. Even the US, one of the most liberal countries for the topics the movie explores, withdrew the trailer after the intense strobe effects and demonic face caused nausea and panic attacks in its audience.
Holy water.
But, as always, the bans only made the movie more popular. The more governments tried to suppress it, the more it became known as a legendary, boundary-pushing horror. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre follows a group of friends who encounter a family in the sleepy backwoods of rural Texas. After they step foot inside this creepy-looking house, they soon fall victim to Leatherface, a chainsaw-wielding killer, and his deranged relatives. But unlike more modern movies, the movie doesn't get its scares or even its tension from overwhelming gore. Instead, its tension is built into the relentless psychological terror at its heart. Scenes of implied dismemberment, prolonged chases, and the infamous meat hook impalement are just moments of shock to break up the true terror of the family at the heart of the story. But what made this movie so controversial and worthy of a ban is how undeniably real the whole thing feels. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was not backed by a major studio, meaning the filmmakers were shooting independently whenever they saw fit. That gave the movie a grainy documentary-style texture, which just made the whole thing feel more raw and chaotic. It's as though the camera happens to catch everything by accident. The sudden brutal killings have no narrative justification. The killers just decide to do it. There's no happy ending, no Hollywood optimism. The movie is unrelentingly nihilistic with no moral resolution and with survivors left traumatized and perpetrators unpunished. All of that proved to be far too much for people to cope with, and that led to bans in at least 12 different countries, with the ban lasting decades. Germany being the longest holdout, eventually lifting the ban in 2011 and allowing people to indulge in the disturbing, brutal tone of the movie. Don't go in the house. Don't Go in the House follows Donnie Kohler, a traumatized man who suffers from traumatic memories of a childhood where his mother burned him as punishment, leaving him fixated on fire and detached from reality. When she dies, Donnie constructs a fireproof room and sets out to women with a flamethrower, culminating in hallucinations of his mother's vengeful corpse. But the movie came out just at the moment that the UK was having a serious moral panic. Conservative politicians were seriously worried that extreme horror movies like The Evil Dead and Holocaust were destroying modern decency. They passed a law to ban what they called video nasties. Then Don't Go in the House came out. From the second it was released, critics worldwide condemned it for its abusive and misogynistic violence, particularly the flamethrower murders and Donnie's psychological unraveling. The film's most notorious scene features a woman stripped naked, chained to a ceiling, and set on fire while the camera lingers on her agonized screams. It's a sequence that's often been called exploitative and sadistic, and it was instantly banned. British authorities confiscated uncertified copies of the movie, and anybody caught selling it could be put in prison. For over a decade, the movie was legally banned, and even when the law was repealed, the only versions released were heavily censored. The movie's lingering obsession on burning victims matches its protagonist, but it doesn't make the movie easy to stomach. Yet the ban just made it even more of a cult movie, with people seeking it out under the radar to see what all the fuss was about. Level 2. Hostel Part 2, 2007. In 2007, Eli Roth released the sequel to his 2005 horror hit, Hostel, which itself was pretty controversial, but Hostel Part 2 would be a lot more scandalous. The movie follows 3 American art students, Beth, Whitney, and Lorna, who are lured to a Slovakian hostel under the guise of a spa retreat. But unbeknownst to them, they are auctioned online to wealthy clients who pay to and victims in a secret facility. But this movie really expands and digs into the lore of the franchise, exploring the psychology of the perpetrators, including an unexpectedly submissive family man, and the victims while escalating the brutality. The movie was censored worldwide far more than the first purely because of the extent of violence throughout, especially one key scene, the bloodbath. The scene depicts an antagonist, Mrs. Bathory, slashing a naked, inverted Lorna with a scythe and bathing in her blood before slitting her throat. That scene alone ended up forcing many bans. New Zealand banned the movie because this scene was considered injurious to the public good. Even though the public was in favor of not banning it, the film board refused to drop the ban and the studio would not censor the movie. Other scenes proved difficult for other governments. Another climax involves Beth severing a captor's genitalia with scissors, leaving him to bleed out, while other moments were criticized for their prolonged violence, particularly against women. Germany ended up censoring the movie, and even to this day, the film remains restricted to adults. Other nations released the movie without cuts, and got widely criticized by the government for doing so. Apocalypse. Antonio Margheriti wanted to do something radical with his movie Cannibal Apocalypse. He wanted to blend Vietnam War trauma with cannibal horror to create something horrifying and culturally relevant. The film follows Norman Hopper, a veteran haunted by a 1972 incident in Vietnam where he was bitten by a POW infected with a virus. Years later in Atlanta, Hopper and 2 fellow veterans succumbed to the virus, spreading it through bites and triggering a violent outbreak. Authorities pursue the infected through sewers and streets, culminating in a flamethrower-fueled showdown while Hopper's suburban life unravels as his neighbors and first responders fall victim. The movie came just after the Vietnam War in the 1970s, and Margheriti was one of many filmmakers opposed to the war and its aftermath. He made the movie specifically to criticize the dehumanizing impact, framing cannibalism as a metaphor for PTSD and the societal abandonment of veterans. But his producers had seen how successful the Dawn of the Dead trend was working out and wanted in, so they pressured him to amplify the gore to get more violent and chaotic. Soon enough, this pivot overshadowed the commentary entirely. The movie started adding new, increasingly graphic sequences, including a rat set ablaze for real in the sewers and a victim dismembered by an angle grinder. Those scenes ended up leading to global bans, with the UK classifying it as a video nasty, prosecuting distributors under obscenity laws and enforcing cuts until 2005. Margheriti had something important to say, and his movie had now been essentially dismissed because of his producers. The critics were all focused on the violence, dismissing anything the movie said about Vietnam. The Human Centipede series, 2009 to 2015. The Human Centipede trilogy was known for one thing: outrage. The first film, The Human Centipede, first sequence, follows deranged German surgeon Dr. Josef Heiter, who surgically connects 3 kidnapped victims mouth to anus to create a human centipede. Though the idea of it is extreme and gross, the movie actually shows very little of it and not much on-screen gore at all, with the BBFC deeming it relatively traditional horror and granting an uncut 18 certificate. The sequel, however, would be much, much worse. The Human Centipede 2 full sequence escalated the brutality to an unthinkable degree. It centers on Martin, a mentally disturbed man who recreates a 12-person centipede using less medical and more barbaric methods like hammering teeth and stapling lips to anuses. The BBFC initially banned the uncut version, calling it violent and potentially obscene, citing risks of harm and obscenity laws. After 32 cuts, including sandpaper and forced defecation scenes, it received an 18 rating. The ban fueled global outrage toward the movie, with critics condemning the nihilistic violence and dehumanization of victims, which even included the killing of a baby. The Human Centipede 3 final sequence pushed the absurdity further than either of the other movies. This final movie sees a psychopathic prison warden and his accountant create a 500-person centipede featuring scenes of mass castration and political satire.
Well, Doctor, what do you think? Is it possible?
Very clever, Mr. Butler.
The BBFC permitted it uncut but criticized its frequent strong bloody violence, including waterboarding and sexual assault. Reviews widely trashed it as repetitive and overwhelmingly gory, but it was far less controversial than the second movie. In fact, the second had gone so far in trying to shock that the third could never top it. Pink Flamingos. John Waters' 1972 underground film Pink Flamingos centers on Divine, a drag queen criminal who proudly defends her tabloid-bestowed title as the filthiest person alive against rivals Connie and Raymond Marble.
Could you give us some of your political beliefs?
Everyone now, condone first-degree murder, advocate eat. Filth are my politics, filth is my life. Take whatever you like.
The Marbles, portrayed as grotesque antagonists, run a kidnapping ring, imprisoning women to sell their infants to lesbian couples while funding distribution in schools. Their campaign to sabotage Divine escalates into mutual acts of depravity, including public exposure and animal cruelty, culminating in Divine consuming fresh dog feces to reaffirm her supremacy as a filthy, filthy person. Waters structured the plot as a deliberate provocation to everything decent in society, a series of scenes that would violate every imaginable cultural taboo. The film's most infamous moment, Divine eating real dog poop, was thought up as a publicity stunt to ensure audiences could never forget the movie. Other sequences, like a man rhythmically dilating his anus or live chickens crushed during a act, were included to maximize shock value and create as much controversy as possible. And John Waters loved that. It's what he lives for. He said, "To me, bad taste is what entertainment is all about," arguing that the film is a rebellion against good taste mainstream sensibilities, which is exactly why bans swiftly followed from the mainstream industry. The movie was banned in Switzerland and Australia and remains banned in New Zealand. The BBFC required 3 minutes of cuts before release, excising scenes of animal cruelty and explicit content involving the mother-son romance. In the US, Waters faced obscenity charges for even making the movie. Hicksville, New York technically retains a legal threat against screening the movie, with Waters often joking he avoids the town to dodge arrest. But all of the backlash thrilled John Waters. He said that the reports of people vomiting and walking out were a standing ovation. The movie turned him into an underground, iconic cult filmmaker and made Divine a star. Level 3. Let Sleeping Corpses Lie. In Let Sleeping Corpses Lie, a machine designed to emit ultrasonic radiation to kill insects accidentally manages to reanimate corpses, triggering a rural zombie outbreak in England. Motorcyclist George and driver Edna, both wrongly accused of murders committed by the undead, face relentless aggression by authorities. And no matter how much they deny it, a reactionary police inspector dismisses their claims, insisting the pair are drug-addled Satanists responsible for the carnage.
Sign here and it'll be a lot easier for you. Admit 2 officers and it'll be all over.
It was the corpses.
The film's graphic violence sparked immediate backlash. Zombies disembowel victims, chew on their entrails, and the corpses. That's pretty standard zombie stuff, but the movie took it further with a addicted character's overdose and a nude protest scene fueling more intense controversy. Its visceral gore and content led to inclusion on the UK's Video Nasties blacklist in the 1980s, with prosecutors citing severe depictions of brutality. But other countries were less concerned with the violence and more bothered by what it meant. The director, Jorge Grau, didn't just make a zombie movie, he made a social critique of institutional failure and environmental recklessness. The zombie plague stems from government-approved and environmentally damaging technology, while the police's continued scapegoating of George and Edna was a direct reflection of how society was marginalizing and ignoring the young people of the 1970s who embraced the alternative counterculture. Malaysia banned the film outright, citing explicit and violent content, but actually, the movie's themes of authoritarian incompetence and anti-establishment rhetoric likely contributed to the censorship, given the country's history of restricting works criticizing its leadership. In the final act of the movie, George destroys the radiation device, temporarily stopping the undead and effectively saving the world. But authorities repair it, reigniting the outbreak in the name of following their industrial orders. A final hospital massacre sees zombies overrunning staff and patients before George's desperate intervention. The inspector, still denying the truth, fatally shoots George only to be killed by his reanimated corpse, once again demonstrating the theme of the movie, that governments and authority figures will always ignore the people and destroy everything. The House by the Cemetery. The House by the Cemetery follows the Boyle family as they move into a New England home tied to Dr. Jacob Freudstein, a deranged 19th century surgeon who prolongs his decaying existence by harvesting his victims' body parts. Their son encounters the ghost of a girl linked to Freudstein's crimes, while his parents uncover a cellar filled with corpses and surgical tools. The family's attempts to flee culminate in a violent confrontation with Freudstein, whose grotesque appearance and brutal kills, including throat and are as visceral as anything in the movie.
Mommy! Open the door for me! It's scary in here!
Upon its UK release, the BBFC cut 86 seconds of gore, including a knife through a victim's head and a throat-slashing scene. But just 2 years later, despite these edits, The film was labeled a video nasty under the 1984 Video Recording Act, leading to obscenity prosecutions and bans. A 1988 VHS release removed an additional 4 minutes of footage, such as Freudstein's bat attack and close-up of bodies, rendering the plot nearly incoherent and the movie utterly unwatchable. In 1992, another re-release saw the movie butchered even more, cutting out another 7 minutes. The runtime went from 86 minutes to 74 minutes. The film finally debuted uncut in 2009 after the BBFC relaxed its stance on content, though all of the edits and distributor tampering left earlier releases notoriously incoherent and nonsensical. The Beyond, 1981. Lucio Fulci's The Beyond is all about Liza Merrill, a New Orleans woman who inherits a dilapidated Louisiana hotel unknowingly built atop one of 7 gateways to hell. The film opens in 1927 with the violent lynching of Warlock Schweik, whose death curses the property. Decades later, Liza's renovation efforts awaken malevolent forces, triggering a series of gruesome supernatural deaths. A plumber is attacked, a worker is devoured by tarantulas, and a woman's face is burned by acid. As the gateway opens, the dead rise, and Lila teams with local doctor John McCabe to survive the escalating chaos, culminating in their descent into a strange, otherworldly purgatory. Fulci has no interest in creating a cohesive narrative. He wants to just build a series of strange, disconnected, visceral set pieces. There's no clear explanations, just some hints. A cryptic book references the Hellgate, while flashbacks hint at Schweik's occult influence. But they're really just there to thread together grotesque sequences. But the amount of eye-based violence, including eyeball gouging and face disillusion, were too much for many people in the 1980s to tolerate. The movie was banned in the UK as a video nasty and heavily censored in the US release, with 11 minutes cut. However, the movie really was not that bad compared to others of the era. The film emerged during Italy's 1980s horror boom, where directors like Dario Argento and Lamberto Bava were making highly surreal and disturbing movies that included this kind of imagery. Today, The Beyond is considered a masterpiece, but it overcame a lot of controversy to reach that point. Zombie. The plot of Zombie centers on Matul, a Caribbean island where a voodoo curse resurrects the dead, leading to attacks on the living. After a zombie-infected boat drifts into New York Harbor, a New York journalist and a scientist's daughter travel to the island alongside hired guides, encountering Dr. Menard, who struggles to contain the outbreak. Like many horror movies from the 1980s, the movie features some pretty intense and highly gory sequences, including a zombie assault on a shark underwater and, maybe the most graphic of the entire movie, a woman's eye impaled on a splintered door frame during a home invasion. But because this movie was pre-CGI, the film relied on practical effects to depict visceral violence, using prosthetics, latex, and animal entrails to stage graphic moments like throats torn open, decaying flesh, and a zombie's arm ripped off mid-shark battle. And that just made them more realistic and troubling. In fact, these unflinching visuals drew some very serious censorship, particularly in the UK. The movie was banned under the Obscene Publications Act during the 1980s Video Nasties panic, with authorities targeting its uncut VHS release, removing over 2 minutes of footage, including the eye trauma and throat ripping. Essentially, the movie board removed everything that made the movie so impactful. Yet, despite the cuts, the film's reputation for extreme content solidified its notoriety, with later distributors capitalizing on its infamy during re-releases. Nightmare, 1981. Nightmare follows George Tatum, a schizophrenic released from a psychiatric institution after undergoing experimental brain treatment. Plagued by violent childhood memories of axing his father and his lover, George embarks on a killing spree from New York to Florida, targeting his ex-wife Susan and their children. This is not your usual slasher movie. This is a movie that blends the graphic slasher violence with psychological trauma, refusing to look away as George repeatedly murders people we don't even know. We have to see the throat slashing, repeated ice pick stabbings, and slow-motion axe murders in George's flashbacks whether we want to or not. All until we get that big blood-soaked climax where George's son CJ retaliates against his dad with a revolver. But the movie was so unflinching with its gore and psycho themes that it led to an X rating in the US and a ban in the UK, where it was branded a video nasty. British authorities demanded 48 seconds of cuts, mostly to the ice pick kill and flashback violence. But for the first time in the video nasty era, the distributor actually refused to obey the ruling, releasing the uncut version as Nightmares in a Damaged Brain. The blatant disobedience launched a landmark obscenity trial that saw 2 executives receive prison sentences, the only jail terms in the entirety of the UK's video nasty crackdown. The film remained banned until 2002 with a censored version approved for video. But the full uncut print wasn't legalized until 2015, eventually making the time those executives spent in prison completely wasted time. Australia also censored the film, releasing a heavily edited 89-minute version titled Schizo that omitted key violence sequences. Sweet Movie. Dusan Macaveo's 1974 film Sweet Movie juxtaposes 2 surreal, highly controversial narratives to critique capitalist and communist ideologies through disturbing and gross satire. The first follows Ms. Canada, a beauty queen who wins a Most Virgin contest and marries a milk tycoon, Mr. Capital. As you can see, this is not a subtle movie. Their marriage quickly devolves into humiliation, including a scene where he pees on her during a degrading encounter. She escapes to Paris, engages in a public act interrupted by nuns, and joins an anarchic commune where members participate in ritualistic rebirths involving pooping and peeing. The second narrative centers on Anna Planeta, a communist revolutionary steering a candy-laden barge with a Karl Marx figurehead through Amsterdam's canals. She seduces a sailor named Potemkin, stabs him during sex, and later lures children aboard with sweets. Authorities arrest her after discovering the children's bodies in plastic sacks, though the film ambiguously suggests their rebirth. The movie was banned in multiple countries because of its explicit scenes of nudity, vomit, and group defecation. The BBFC rejected it outright in 1975, citing unacceptable content, while the 1978 Protection of Children Act raised legal concerns over Anna's nude interaction with children. It was quite literally breaking the law. The filmmakers attempted to re-edit the film, but couldn't find a way to remove the problematic scenes without harming their social message, so the UK decided to ban it outright. The US followed the same course before allowing limited art house releases to small, curious audiences. But the movie's blending of political commentary with visceral shock tactics worked for the audience that wanted it, but the graphic imagery continues to overshadow its satirical intent. Level 4. Evil Speak. Evil Speak follows Stanley Coopersmith, a bullied orphan at a military academy who discovers a hidden satanic manuscript beneath the school's chapel. The text, authored by 16th century excommunicated priest Father Esteban, outlines rituals for summoning demonic forces. Coopersmith uses his computer to translate the Latin incantations, accidentally reviving Esteban's spirit, which he decides to use to seek violent retribution against his tormentors. By the film's climax, Coopersmith, now possessed by Esteban, orchestrates a massacre with demonic boars, decapitations, and supernatural forces leading to the Academy's total destruction.
Let them avenge me, and I will pledge my soul to you.
Of course, the movie's explicit occult themes, including detailed black mass rituals, satanic possession, and desecration of sacred religious symbols, drew immediate scrutiny. British censors under the 1984 Video Recordings Act classified Evil Speak as a video nasty, banning it for over a decade. They argued that the movie's portrayal of Satanism could inspire real-world copycats, while its graphic violence, including a teacher impaled on a spiked wheel and a beating heart ripped straight out of a victim's chest, was described as excessively gruesome. In the US, it faced heavy cuts to secure an R rating, though uncut versions circulated underground, further fueling its controversial reputation. But while censors were horrified by the content, critics found the movie to be laughable. It was low budget, unconvincing, and far too campy to be taken seriously. The censorship seemed like an overreaction to a movie that, according to critics, nobody would ever actually see. Maniac. William Lustig's Maniac follows Frank Zito, a mentally unstable New Yorker who stalks women, them, and mounts their scalps on mannequins in his tiny, claustrophobic apartment. The film's grisly violence, largely driven by Zito's traumatic childhood by his mother, heavily relied on Tom Savini's visceral practical effects to amplify its shock value.
Mommy, please don't lock me in the closet. Please, Mommy, I'll be good.
It just so happened that Savini was very, very good at what he did, making some of the most realistic effects of his era. Fresh from Dawn of the Dead, Savini engineered graphic scalpings, a bayonet impalement, and the film's most notorious sequence, a point-blank shotgun blast to a victim's head, using a mold of his own skull filled with awful and fake blood. The scene, filmed guerrilla style with live ammunition, forced the crew to flee before police arrived. It was simply too realistic. Maniac's unflinching gore and bleak tone sparked immediate backlash. In the US, theaters faced protests for even daring to screen it, and the Los Angeles Times refused to run ads for the movie, prompting marketing to lean into the controversy with slogans like, "See the film the LA Times won't carry ads for." The BBFC banned it outright in 1981, deeming it obscene, and rejected a video release in 1998. A heavily cut version finally debuted in UK cinemas in 2002 after 58 seconds of edits to violent and scenes. Finland and Sweden froze frames during gore to bypass censorship, while Germany lifted its ban only in 2020. Stylistically, Maniac's realistic approach, shooting on New York streets without permits, heightened its disturbing realism. It was as though the camera just picked up these acts, and we, as the audience, can only observe and take it in. Faces of Death. Faces of Death is a pseudo-documentary framed as a real-world exploration of morality. Let's break that down a little bit. Directed by John Allen Schwartz under a series of pseudonyms, the film follows fictional pathologist Francis B. Gross, who curates a grim anthology of death footage. The movie is a unique blend of archival material with staged fake sequences, which was hugely popular in the 1960s and 70s. Later, it was confirmed that around 40% of the movie's content was staged, including some of the more notoriously disturbing moments, like a monkey brain banquet, which actually was just a cauliflower dyed red, and a cannibal cult ritual. But the movie was released before the internet was a thing. Nobody could verify anything. So when the movie took actual authentic newsreels of accidents, Holocaust atrocities, and the aftermath of plane crashes, and intercut it with convincingly faked violence like an alligator attack or an electric chair execution, it blurred lines so effectively that many viewers believed it contained authentic snuff footage. And Schwartz knew this. He loved it. He said that he wanted to deceive the audience and provoke debates about mortality and exploitation. The authorities, though, had no interest in a debate. Australia banned the film outright in 1980, citing frequent high-intensity gratuitous violence, while police raids targeted video stores distributing illegal copies. Sensationalist media reports started linking the film to real-life murders, even though there was no evidence that any of it was true. Critics hated the movie as much as the authorities, condemning its ethics, but its fusion of shockumentary and narrative laid the groundwork for what we know today as the found footage horror genre. This movie was just ahead of its time. The Beast in Heat. Set in the final days of World War II, The Beast in Heat follows SS officer Dr. Ellen Kratch, a sadistic biologist conducting experiments in an occupied European village. Her experiments led her to genetically engineer a deformed, beast to terrorize captured allies, subjecting prisoners, primarily women, to graphic violence and humiliation. The movie follows Kratch's pursuit of her inhuman creation, with the torture escalating as Allied forces advance, leading to forced nudity, genital electrocution, fingernail extraction, and a woman strapped with a flaming bucket of rats burrowing into her stomach. Ultimately, Kratch dies at the hand of her creation. The film was part of a 1970s trend known as Nazi-sploitation, a subgenre blending wartime exploitation with extreme violence and Nazi iconography. It was purely built around the shock value of framing Nazis as cartoonish villains committing atrocities. In fact, The Beast in Heat was only built around a torture component. The movie was so short that they had to use footage from earlier war films to pad the runtime. There was no other purpose to making the movie other than the shocking scenes. Those scenes, including full frontal nudity, prolonged sequences, and a machine-gunned infant, to name just 3, triggered global backlash. The UK banned it as a video nasty in 1984 under the Video Recordings Act, citing obscenity laws. While other banned films later secured releases with edits, The Beast in Heat remains banned in the UK, its uncut version surviving only through bootlegs and niche distributors. Necromantique, 1988. Necromantique, directed by Jörg Buttgereit, follows Robert Schmudtke, a Berlin street cleaner who collects human remains from accident sites. He and his partner, Betty, engage in necrophilic acts with a decomposing corpse smuggled into their apartment, which is filled with preserved body parts. After Robert is fired, Betty abandons him, taking the corpse with her. Lost without his routine, Robert's mental collapse escalates into killing their cat, worker, and ultimately committing suicide while The film's explicit depiction of necrophilia, animal cruelty, including a real cat which was actually killed on camera, and uncensored gore sparked immediate backlash. But it didn't stop there. The movie's sequel, Necromantique 2, centers on Monica, a mortician who exhumes Robert's corpse for gratification before pursuing a relationship with Mark, a voice actor for films. She introduces him to necrophilia and hides Robert's severed genitalia in her fridge. The sequel was somehow even more controversial than the first one, including much longer necrophilic sequences, and including a subplot criticizing Germany's censorship laws, largely as a response to the controversy around the first movie. Both films were banned in multiple countries for glorifying violence and graphic content. German authorities confiscated prints of Necromantique 2 in 1991, planning to charge Buttgereit with a crime until a court later classified it as art. Over 30 countries restricted the films, with the UK only approving an uncut version of Necromantique in 2015. Legal battles and raids targeting distributors cemented their status as the most banned movies in the world. Braindead, 1992, aka Dead Alive. Peter Jackson's Braindead follows Lionel Cosgrove, a meek man in Wellington, New Zealand, whose life unravels after his domineering mother Vera is bitten by a Sumatran rat monkey, a grotesque hybrid creature smuggled from Skull Island. The bite triggers a violent zombification process, beginning with Vera's death and reanimation as a flesh-hungry monster.
It's a great honor.
Lionel attempts to contain the outbreak by sedating her in his basement, but her infection spreads, infecting others, including a nurse, a priest, and local hoodlums, creating a ragtag horde of the undead. But the situation escalates massively when Lionel's opportunistic uncle Les discovers the zombies and hosts a chaotic house party. Suddenly, guests are infected en masse, leading to a blood-soaked showdown. Lionel battles the horde with a lawnmower, shredding zombies in a giant fountain of blood, while his love interest, Paquita, pulverizes the remaining limbs in a blender. The climax pits Lionel against his now gigantic mother, who he defeats by using a pendant to slice free from her monstrous stomach. Filmed on a tiny $3 million budget, Braindead became notorious for its excessive gore, including a zombie's face glowing from a light bulb stab, a man's skeleton ripped right out of his body, and a zombie baby birthed from 2 infected characters. The uncut version added minutes of extra carnage, earning it the title of one of cinema's goriest films, if it could actually be seen. The movie was instantly banned in Germany, South Korea, Singapore, and Finland for its graphic violence and visceral humor. And the film faced censorship board scrutiny elsewhere for scenes like Vera's tram and the lawnmower massacre. The movie was considered way too violent to be seen uncut. And by the time the censors had cut the problematic scenes, the movie was doomed to be a box office failure. But Braindead cemented its legacy as a cult classic, with Jackson's slapstick approach to splatter horror introducing a bold new filmmaker who would go on to create legendary movies like The Lord of the Rings and King Kong. Level 5. Mai-chan's Daily Life. Mai-chan's Daily Life adapts Waita Utsuga's controversial 2004 manga Mai-chan no Nichijou, following Miyako, a young woman hired as a live-in maid at a secluded mansion. She meets Mai, an immortal 17-year-old forced to endure daily due to her regenerative abilities. The estate's wheelchair-bound master and his assistant Kaede rent Mai out to wealthy clients for sadistic acts, escalating from humiliation to chainsaw dismemberment and eye gouging. Initially repulsed, Miyako gradually participates in Mai's torment, culminating in a frenzied third act where she disembowels Mai with a chainsaw in a twisted act of intimacy. The manga was classified as eroguro, erotic grotesque, and gained notoriety very quickly for graphic scenes of dismemberment, including a subplot involving a child masochist. And the movie amplifies basically every single controversy while toning some things down. The movie cuts out the subplot with the child masochist, one of the only acts of mercy you get from this film. Otherwise, the movie retains the core elements of the manga, making the violence painfully real. The movie was marketed as a diabolical dark comedy, which is not the way most people would describe it. But the film faced restricted release due to its graphic content, which was somewhat divisive. Critics pointed out that the movie had a blatant absurdist tone and a deliberate lack of narrative logic, which clearly set the movie in a world that was not to be taken seriously. But the movie still had a controversial and cult reputation for scenes like Miyako's awakening through her complicit violence and Mai's repeated. Whether it glamorizes abuse or is a satire is completely up to the viewer. But one thing you can say for sure, it's pretty brutal. Antichrist, 2009. Lars von Trier's Antichrist follows an unnamed couple grappling with the accidental death of their infant son, as depicted in a pretty painful opening scene. Retreating to their remote cabin, which they call Eden, the husband, a therapist, attempts to treat his wife's grief through exposure therapy, only to confront her escalating violent and sexual behavior. The movie was written during von Trier's hospitalization for depression, but it was controversial before anyone even saw it. A producer leaked its original premise, which depicted Earth as Satan's creation, forcing a drastic rewrite that changed the entire course of the movie. The film suddenly became much more complex and personal, and when he started making the movie, von Trier went further and further, convincing his actors to perform unsimulated scenes. That's having real sex on camera. He decided that his movie wouldn't shy away from graphic violence either, including genital with scissors and a sequence where Willem Dafoe's character is drilled through the leg with a grindstone. all of it through Von Trier's typical visceral, realistic lens. The British Board of Film Classification, in a particularly surprising move, approved the uncut release without hesitation, deeming its explicit and violence exceptionally justified for thematic exploration, although it did acknowledge the movie's shock value. Not everyone saw it that way. When the movie premiered at Cannes, it triggered walkouts, fainting, and derision from those in attendance. Charlotte Gainsbourg won Best Actress for her role as the unnamed woman, but the jury condemned the movie as misogynistic, even awarding it an anti-prize. This wildly divisive reception came to define the movie. Some people loved it and hailed its raw examination of grief and gender dynamics, while others said it was sadistic and horribly misogynistic. France briefly banned it in 2016 after protests, reclassifying it from 16 to 18, forcing Willem Dafoe to defend the film, arguing it explores women's power, not misogyny. But the movie is one of Von Trier's most difficult and divisive, even to this day. Inside. On Christmas Eve 2007, 4 months after a car accident killed her husband, heavily pregnant Sarah Scarangella prepares for an induced delivery the next day. But suddenly a mysterious woman appears at her isolated suburban home. The woman initially requests help, but soon she reveals her sinister intent for arriving at the house. She wants to extract Sarah's unborn child by force. Over the next hours, the intruder, who was later revealed as the other driver from Sarah's fatal crash who lost her own baby in the collision, methodically kills anyone who intervenes, including Sarah's mother, employer, and multiple police officers. This is Inside, a French horror movie that is part of France's new Extremity movement, which aims to push the boundaries of cinema to explore violence and more openly. But it's an unflinchingly violent and disturbing movie, escalating in intensity. Early scenes depict the assailant slashing Sarah's face with scissors and her hand to a wall, but it's nothing compared to the climax, a blood-soaked DIY cesarean. With Sarah in labor and the baby stuck, the attacker uses scissors to cut the infant from her womb as the mother-to-be bleeds out on a staircase. This 3-minute sequence featuring explicit gore and realistic childbirth trauma became the focal point of censorship debates. Inside faced immediate bans in Norway, Germany, and New Zealand, while Australia restricted it to film festivals only. Pretty much all of the territories that had an issue with the movie demanded cuts to the cesarean scene, as well as a few other graphic moments involving eye gouging with knitting needles and a police officer's point-blank shotgun execution. But even though these measures were taken, bootleg uncut versions circulated widely. And even though French critics initially condemned the film's brutality, they later reassessed it as a commentary on grief and maternal anxiety. Even today, the movie is hailed as a phenomenally well-done and unrelenting horror movie. Martyrs, 2008. Pascal Augier's Martyrs opens with Lucie Urine, a traumatized woman who escapes childhood captivity and later a suburban family she believes orchestrated her. Her friend Anna Sui, a fellow survivor, discovers a hidden chamber in the victim's home, revealing a secret society that systematically tortures women to induce transcendental visions of the afterlife. Anna is soon captured, subjected to extreme physical and psychological torture, and flayed alive to reach the final stage of martyrdom. Even the synopsis is traumatic and aggressive, but it's nothing compared to the finished movie. The film's unflinching violence, including graphic beatings, self-harm, and that prolonged flaying sequence, was reportedly the cause of mass walkouts and vomiting at festivals like Fright Fest and TIFF. In France, regulators initially issued a rare 18+ rating, which is effectively a commercial ban that means nobody will see it, before downgrading it to 16+ because of protests from the filmmakers themselves. While critics were condemning it as Laugier argued the brutality served a narrative purpose. To him, the movie was exploring whether pain could reveal existential truths. In fact, Laugier, who wrote the script during a depressive period, constantly rejected claims of exploitation, saying that Martyrs was a melodrama meant to evoke melancholy, not disgust. However, the world didn't seem to agree. Level 6. Wedding Trough. Thierry Zeno's Wedding Trough follows a reclusive farmer whose disturbing actions escalate into violence and self-destruction. The lead character engages in erratic behavior, collecting feces, poultry, and forming an obsessive bond with a female pig. After he assaults the animal, he kills her piglets when they reject his advances, leading the distraught mother to drown herself. The farmer's by hanging ends the movie, with the final shot implying his ascension to some other spiritual plane. Zeno described the film as an exploration of alchemy and humanity's quest to transform death into life, arguing that the protagonist's acts were symbolic rather than literal. Which is hard to accept when you've seen a movie where the guy is quite literally doing these things. But he argued that the scenes involving eating and all of the animal interactions were intended to represent metaphysical concepts, though he was very clear to say that the pig's on-screen death was staged using a farmer-slaughtered animal. He didn't say anything about the rest of the movie, but we'll assume that's all staged too. The film's graphic zoophilia, animal cruelty, and explicit content triggered immediate controversy. Australia banned it under obscenity laws, with 2 failed appeals solidifying its refused classification status. Authorities were not subtle, saying that its abhorrent depictions of bestiality were irredeemable, and even to this day, the movie is banned there. Zeno faced accusations of glorifying violence, particularly after the Australian Classification Board noted the high impact of its unflinching scenes, but he always maintained that the movie was one big metaphor. The Green Elephant. The Green Elephant is a Russian art house horror film directed by Svetlana Boskova. It's mostly known for its graphic violence and subversive critique of militarism, which made Russia very, very, very angry. Set in 1986, the story follows 2 Soviet junior officers confined to a squalid military prison cell. Their degrading environment, dripping green-walled basement, becomes the setting for escalating psychological. Initially, the 2 officers just trade crude stories, but as the movie goes on, their dynamic spirals into brutality after one officer forces the other to clean a toilet with a fork. The character smears and consumes the he finds, triggering further violence from guards and a sadistic captain who subjects them to humiliations, forced situations, and ultimately, all of it leads into a visceral climax of face-eating and corpse desecration. It's a truly stomach-churning movie. And Boskova, who is a vocal leftist critic of post-Soviet capitalism, wanted it to be as realistic as humanly possible. She thought of this movie as a political protest. So the guerrilla-style production, which of course was not endorsed or approved by the Russian government, used real slaughterhouse blood, improvised dialogue, and unflinching performances to make it as raw and confrontational as possible. But because of the cultural circumstances of Russia, the movie was distributed underground without drawing too much attention. The Green Elephant gained notoriety at the 2005 Rotterdam Film Festival, where programmers highlighted its relevance during Russia's Chechen War. Today, the movie is still banned in Russia, with the government claiming its graphic content and unauthorized use of copyrighted music was unacceptable.
Зеленый слоник.
But everybody knows that the ban was actually because of its anti-war themes, which exposed military corruption and psychological decay within the Soviet-era army. Themes that Russian presidents, including Vladimir Putin, would not appreciate. Slaughtered Vomit Dolls. Slaughtered Vomit Dolls was directed by self-proclaimed Satanist filmmaker Lucifer Valentine, which should give you an idea of what to expect from this movie.
I'm not here.
The film chronicles the fractured existence of Angela Aberdeen, a teenage runaway turned bulimic stripper and prostitute. It's structured as a surreal, non-linear collage of hallucinations and intercutting Angela's confessional monologues with graphic scenes of vomiting and a lot of satanic rituals. When he made the movie, Valentine coined a new term to describe it: vomit gore, a gross-out mix of puke and blood at every turn, and he wanted to deliver on that stomach-turning promise. The movie has a lot of sequences depicting eyeballs gouged with screwdrivers, limbs severed mid-performance, and cannibalistic acts, all filmed in a gritty handheld style that blurs reality and psychotic hallucinations. All of these explicit scenes lack any narrative context, instead emphasizing sensory overload through repetitive vomiting, blood-soaked violence, and the movie doesn't want you to think, it wants you to puke. The film's fragmented structure, which jumps between Angela's traumatic memories, imagined atrocities, and detached gore, was immensely off-putting to mainstream distributors. And critics agreed, widely condemning its depictions of violence against women and perceived misogyny, with reviews calling it glorified vomit pornography. Which, again, is really what Valentine was going for. Eventually, underground distributor Unearthed Films released it directly to DVD alongside a limited theatrical run, bypassing traditional festivals that rejected it as too disgusting to be seen. But while the finished product was disgusting enough, rumors have long surrounded its production, including claims Valentine exploited addicted performers. The 2017 double homicide of lead actress Amiara LaVey, who played Angela, had just made it even more macabre and appealing to extreme horror audiences. Lucker the Necrophagus, 1986. Lucker the Necrophagus, directed by Belgian filmmaker Johan van der Woestijnen, follows John Lucker, a serial killer and necrophiliac who escapes a psychiatric hospital to resume his violent spree. Targeting Kathy Jordan, the sole survivor of his earlier attacks, Lucker leaves a trail of victims, including a month-long sequence where he has sex with a decomposing corpse in a filthy apartment. The film's nihilistic tone and unflinching violence, including stabbings, disembowelments, and necrophilic acts, are pretty clearly designed just to provoke visceral disgust. But the filmmaker claims he had bigger intentions. Van der Woestijnen conceived the project as a deliberate middle finger to Belgium's government-funded art film establishment, shooting in English to bypass their Flemish-language funding requirements. He made the movie for $30,000 with non-professional actors, prioritizing graphic content over narrative coherence to shock audiences. Or in his words, it was an anti-art statement, rejecting snobby artistic pretense in favor of raw exploitation. But the producer was so horrified by the movie that Van der Woestijnen made that he destroyed the original negatives to prevent it ever being seen, destroying any chance of distribution and forcing the movie to circulate through bootleg Dutch subtitled VHS copies. Once the movie started to catch on, it got banned in multiple countries for its extreme content. It did, of course, gain infamy among horror collectors, though critics attacked its amateurish style as messy and weak and too desperate to shock. Ferox. Cannibal Ferox follows New York graduate student Gloria Davis and her brother Rudy as they venture into the Amazon to disprove myths.
We've heard several reports recently that along the Cuenca River, one of the Amazon's major tributaries, at least 3 incidents have been witnessed by outsiders. In the village of Manioca.
Joined by friend Pat, they encounter drug dealer Mike and his wounded partner Joe, who claim to have escaped attacks.
Who are you guys? What happened? They attacked us. We gotta get out of here. Come on.
Soon, Mike's true role emerges, revealing that he tortured and murdered a tribal guide during a cocaine-fueled emerald hunt, provoking the tribe's retaliation against them. The group is captured and subjected to including castration and hooks through breasts and ritualistic. Gloria survives but fabricates her account in a book, totally erasing the atrocities. When it was released, the movie was instantly dubbed the most violent film ever made by distributors and quickly gained notoriety for unflinching gore, real animal cruelty with a muskrat, leopard, and turtle killed for real on camera, and prolonged torture scenes. It went on to earn a Guinness World Record as the most banned movie, prohibited in 31 countries, including the UK, where authorities slashed 6+ minutes of violence under the Obscene Publications Act. But like most banned movies of the era, bootleg copies circulated widely, with fans trading uncut versions that preserved its grisly authenticity. Despite, or more realistically because of, its infamy, the film is still as popular as ever with extreme horror fans who continue to seek out original uncut copies. Level 7. Salò, or the 120 Days of 1975. Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salò, or the 120 Days of took the Marquis de Sade's 18th century novel and set it in the middle of Mussolini's fascist Republic of Salò. The history doesn't really matter as much as the horror at the heart of the story. 4 powerful libertines, a duke, bishop, magistrate, and president, kidnap 18 teenagers, imprisoning them in a remote villa for a lot of systematic torture and psychological degradation. The movie is structured around Dante's Inferno and divided into 4 escalating segments: Ante Inferno, Circle of Manias, Circle of and Circle of Blood. In each section, victims endure forced poop eating, genital and ritualized executions, while collaborators and fascist soldiers enable and encourage the horror. Weeks after it premiered in Paris on November 1975, Italy banned the movie. And from that point on, Salò faced global censorship for its explicit violence and cruelty. Australia banned it until 2010, with censors deeming its depictions of adolescent exploitation offensive and cruel. The BBFC acknowledged its deeply serious critique of authoritarian corruption, but said that it was one of the most disgusting films ever seen. Which is true, but at least they acknowledge the intention. Pasolini was a Marxist filmmaker who intended the film as an allegory for fascist power structures and consumerist dehumanization. But he had gone so far with the gore and graphic that any meaning the movie had was almost totally overlooked. But there was another distraction, or maybe a publicity boost depending on your perspective. Just 3 weeks before Salò's release, Pasolini was found brutally near Rome. His body showed signs of beating, crushing injuries, and burns as if his car had been driven over him repeatedly. A 17-year-old hustler confessed to the murder but later recanted his story, alleging threats from unidentified people. Investigative theories linked the killing to stolen reels of the movie, obtained by far-right groups who strongly opposed the social commentary, although that was never confirmed. But the movie remains Pasolini's final and most incendiary work, one that, even today, is considered an extremely difficult movie to watch. Melancholie der Engel. Melancholie der Engel, directed by German filmmaker Marion Dora, follows Katz, a terminally ill man who reunites with his friend Braut at a remote farmhouse tied to their violent past. Joined by 2 teenage girls, a wheelchair-bound woman, and an elderly artist, the group descends into nihilistic depravity. There are extended scenes including poop eating and the ritualistic murder of a newborn in the opening sequence. Katz's impending death fuels a lot of existential debates about morality, faith, and humanity's animalistic nature, all framed through grotesque imagery that contrasts slaughtered animals with human brutality. Dora described the film as a metaphysical exploration of friendship and destiny, asking that viewers abandon their moral judgment to engage with the protagonist's nihilistic worldview. but it seems like that worldview was strongly inspired by the making of the movie. The production lasted 3 weeks with very few cast members actually seeing a script, and a lot of drug use, on-set violence, and Dora's fallout with his co-writer over artistic disputes. The atmosphere on the set was extremely intense and negative, which may explain a lot of the content. But the film sparked international controversy not for any of that, but for unsimulated animal cruelty, including a pig slaughter and amphibian killing. These scenes, alongside graphic human violence, led to bans in multiple countries and many, many classification attempts in Germany, where it was rejected by the FSK board. Despite winning Best Art House Feature at the 2009 New York International Independent Film Festival, its extreme content drew death threats against Dora and divided critics, who either dismissed it as exploitative or hailed its unflinching nihilism. Philosophy of a Knife. Philosophy of a Knife, a 4-hour docudrama directed by Russian filmmaker Andrei Iskanov, chronicles the atrocities of Japan's Unit 731, a covert biological warfare unit that conducted lethal experiments on Chinese, Russian, and Allied prisoners during World War II. The film blends archival footage, interviews with a former Soviet military translator, and graphic reenactments of vivisections, frostbite tests, and plague-infected flea trials. Iskanov, who spent 4 years researching the project, actually ended up facing interrogation from German security services over his sourcing of the classified documents. He wanted to get as much information as he could to present the movie as an exposé of the cruelty. So the film juxtaposes historical testimony with visceral depictions of Unit 731's brutality, including forced abortions, genital mutilation, and white phosphorus burns. Alongside all of that reality, a fictionalized Japanese nurse's narrative details the psychological toll on the people made to perform these acts. But the unflinching violence, which includes long scenes of teeth extraction, disembowelment, and insects inserted into prisoners, drew many accusations of exploitation. Critics were very aggressive about the amateurish acting, the historical erasure of Chinese victims, who in the movie were replaced by white and Russian actors, and the messy and confusing pacing. Distributors ended up flagging the film's content, leading to limited screenings and bans in multiple countries, and even the reviews polarized audiences. Some praised its ambition, but most dismissed it as torture that trivialized real atrocities in the name of entertainment. A Serbian film. A Serbian film follows Miloš, a retired porn actor lured back into the industry by a lucrative offer to star in an art film. Desperate to secure his family's financial future, he signs a contract with director Vukmir, unaware of the project's unhinged and extreme depravity. Miloš is drugged and manipulated into participating in scenes of escalating brutality, including sexual violence against a handcuffed woman, multiple necrophilic acts, and the graphic rape of a newborn infant. As the plot unfolds, Miloš discovers footage of his own exploitation. Under the influence of hallucinogens, he is shown a decapitated corpse and unwittingly assaulting his own son while his brother assaults his wife. The film culminates in a violent confrontation, ending with Miloš of Vukmir's crew before a mutual family suicide. The film's explicit and disturbing depictions of necrophilia and violence led to bans in 46 countries, including Spain, Australia, and Norway. Authorities in Brazil temporarily prohibited screenings entirely, while the UK and US required cuts to reduce its runtime by 4 to 6 minutes. Critics like the BBC's Mark Kermode condemned it as exploitation trash, dismissing the director's claims that the movie was a political allegory about Serbian society. Australia's classification board cited its inextricable link to child abuse themes as justification for a total ban, and Spain's Sitges Film Festival director faced criminal charges for even screening the film, though the charges were later dropped. But despite its infamy and truly depraved, disturbing content, an uncut version later surfaced in the US and UK, marketed to niche horror audiences.